So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the clinical trial landscape, because that's a very big part of what you do, right? You're a clinical psychiatrist who deals with patients on an individual basis, as we've discussed, but you also are heavily involved in another part of this, which is how to do clinical trials. And this is
Yes.
obviously a very important part of this work. Now, Alzheimer's disease and drugs don't have a great marriage. They don't have a great track record the
Uh-huh.
way cardiovascular disease does. And even though oncology is not, great, far from perfect, oncology even has a better track record than Alzheimer's disease. And I think you could make the case, without being hyperbolic, that there is no disease that has a worse track record relative to the inputs on the output side. In other words, there are orphan diseases for which we have no drugs,
Right.
but there have been few shots on goal. So the ratio of shots on goal to goals is lower in Alzheimer's disease than unquestionably any other disease. Okay, on the one level, that undoubtedly speaks to the complexity of the disease. Um, some might argue that on another level, that speaks to the wrong goal, or shooting too late in the game, shooting from too bad an angle at the wrong goal. Like you could
Right.
take this metaphor 10 different ways.
Right.
Um, as it stands today, there are about 120 drugs in the pipeline. If my number crunching has it right, about 27 of them, if we extracted this correctly off clinicaltrials.gov, are in phase 1. So for the listener, meaning these are drugs that are really just being evaluated for safety at this point. So we have some animal data that suggests this is a good idea. We have no idea if it works in humans, but in a very small way with dose escalation, we want to make sure it's safe. About 65 are in phase 2. So that means they've passed that bar of being safe, or at least safe enough to proceed to phase 2, where now we're looking for some efficacy, and we'll, of course, continue to monitor safety. And then 29 are in phase 3, which means at a small scale, they've shown efficacy, typically against a placebo. Now we want to see if there's efficacy, again, either versus a placebo or ideally against a current standard in a larger trial where, again, we're always going to continue to monitor safety. But it's really this third stage that is required for FDA approval. Another way to slice the data is to look at it by category of drug. And I found this to be the most interesting. 12 of these are in the space of cognitive enhancement. 12 are in the space of neuropsychiatric and behavioral improvement, and 97 are in the space of disease modification. Can you explain a little bit what the differences of those three categories mean? And knowing that the next question I'm going to ask you is that how has that evolved over the last 20 years? Because that, to me, has been that was the thing I was most surprised by.
Yeah. So the symptomatic treatments are ones that, can help slow cognitive decline or help improve memory and thinking, but are not targeting the underlying disease process. So all the drugs that we currently have on the market are ones that are symptomatic treatments because they're just helping those neurons communicate. In the case of donepezil and galantamine and ribostigmine, they're cholinesterase inhibitors, and then there's memantine, which is an NMDA receptor antagonist that normalizes levels of glutamate. But they're helping with neurotransmitters, and they're not targeting the underlying pathology of amyloid and tau. Then obviously the behavioral drugs are ones that are being targeted for specific behavior problems in Alzheimer's and other dementia patients, things like apathy, agitation, psychosis, sometimes sleep issues, sometimes even appetite and eating problems. So those all kind of fall under the behavioral umbrella. And then these disease modifying treatments are ones that actually target the underlying pathology. In the case of sort of the biggest group of those that are in trials right now are really monoclonal antibodies against primarily amyloid, but also a few targeting tau, and removing them from the brain in the hopes that then there will be cognitive improvement or at least halting cognitive decline.
Can I interject for a second mechanistically? Is it known exactly where amyloid beta is made? Is it understood how, from where the transcription takes place, or is this all post-translational modification?
Well, so there's a whole science dedicated to that, and it actually is different points along the cascade, so there's the amyloid precursor protein, which is on chromosome 21, which is why people with Down syndrome who have 3 copies of chromosome 21 almost inevitably will get Alzheimer's if they live long enough, because they're making a third more amyloid than the rest of us. So anywhere from the very beginning of our DNA all the way through some of the enzymes that cleave amyloid. So part of the problem is that the amyloid gets cleaved at a length of 40 or 42 amino acids rather than whatever it's supposed to be, which I don't remember. And then the abnormal amyloid kind of folds, and there's fibrils, and there's plaque. The plaque itself is a conglomeration of a series of folds in the protein, and so there are even differences among the antibodies as to what part of that cascade they target.
And amyloid's not necessary. In other words, if you could wave a magic wand and pull amyloid out of a person, is there any ill consequence?
Well, like I said, it is part of blood vessel walls normally. So this pathologic amyloid, these abnormal lengths of A beta 40 and 42, those could be pulled out without consequence because they shouldn't be there in the first place.
So if you wanted to target the system, you would not target the creation of amyloid. You would probably target the enzymes that abnormally cleave.
Well, that is one area that has been studied. The gamma secretase inhibitors, for example, are ones that have been studied. There's and the BACE inhibitors. These are things that are being looked at because these are responsible for cleaving. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times those have had side effects that we didn't really want.
Yeah, I wonder has anybody looked at something like an antisense oligonucleotide that goes straight after the enzyme in a laser precision, basically says you can't make this enzyme, and you don't have to carpet bomb the enzyme and everything around it. You're literally going after the transcription of the enzyme.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. That's for the scientists.
I mean, I'm sure somebody has thought of it and declined. I'm sure there's a reason that hasn't been done.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, sometimes they have thought of it or they've tried it, but then they don't realize what the downstream effects of doing so may be.
Yeah.
And that's been a problem with several of these medications, where it's a great idea, they've identified a target, they've identified compounds that seek out that target, but they cause liver toxicity, or they cause, some other significant medical issue, or they cause cardiac arrhythmias, or things that medically are not safe to continue.
So the thing that surprised me, Amanda, when I looked at the distribution of drugs, just again, this is available on clinicaltrials.gov, is that 80% of the drugs are disease-modifying drugs, which is a good sign, of course, because the other 20%, as you said, are symptomatic. Now, that's not the way the drugs are currently represented. There are there how many drugs? 6 approved drugs for Alzheimer's disease right now?
Well, there's technically 5. Well, yes, there's 6, but one of them is a combination of
2
the
existing.
Other 2.
Right. Okay. Yeah. This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice from any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Finally, I take conflicts of interest very seriously. For all of my disclosures and the companies I invest in or advise, please visit peteratiamd.com/about, where I keep an up-to-date and active list of such companies.